Okay, everyone, we are now live, so you can begin as whenever you'd like.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I'm going to call the meeting for Committee AM to order and remind everyone to please disclose of any pecuniary interest that they may have at the proper time. We're going to start this morning with Infrastructure and Development Services Division. We have 4 pieces of correspondence to receive and file. How does Council want to deal with those?
Starting with that.
Mayor Veens, are you wanting to?
I will move them.
Did you want to group it?
Do you want to do all 4 together, or?
I think so, unless anybody's got any objection.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a seconder to that? Thank you, Bev Hand, Mayor Hand. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. And we'll go on to information reports. The first one is regarding the 2020 bridge and road and bridge construction update. We need a mover and a seconder to have that report put on the floor. Bev Hand and Steve Miller. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that?
I was thinking of A and B moving both
together? Okay.
Yeah. Unless someone needs conversation on any of them. I thought it was receive and file.
Okay. Any questions or comments on those reports? Mr. Cole, is there anything you would like to highlight from those reports?
Thank you, Chair. No, I think the reports are fairly straightforward. A regular update at the end of the year, and just some information on new legislation. So they pretty much speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bill Weaver?
Yeah, I guess the question on the road and bridge construction, 79 Highway at Northville, that stretch that's through the first little part of that road, it's not a very level or surface. Is there more happening to that next spring? I hope it didn't finish up like a nice road, like what we're used to making in Lambton County.
Thank you very much through you, Chair. No, that's totally understandable. It's not the final course, so they still have to come back and do the final course next year, and they'll do any repairs to that subcourse if they need to. But that's not the final product. Something much better is coming next spring. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments? All in favor of receiving and filing those reports? That is carried. Thank you. And we have 2 reports requiring a motion. We're going to start with the one regarding the Gypsy Moth impacts on county lands. Do we have a mover and a seconder for that? Councillor Weber and Councillor Veens. Questions, comments on that report? Councillor Bird.
Thank you, Chair. So this has been going on for far too long now, this particular matter, and I know that many of the residents in Port Franks have been doing house to house, road to road, doing surveys and collecting all the information and giving it into Zimmer Air Services, but it would take a long time doing it like this, one at a time, to get it populated into the Zimmer Air website. And the much milder weather has really not helped, because without the really cold temperatures, I think this gypsy moth infestation will accelerate much faster by the springtime if we don't do something right away. I don't know why the county doesn't hire Zimmer Air Services to spray all the county lands this time round, because, you know, the gypsy moth can travel quite a distance, and if you only spray one small location, you're not saving all the other areas. You know, all our services are paid for through taxes. We don't all use the services provided, but we're all in this together. So I think we should all help out. And I really, truly believe, before this gets any worse, because I'm really alarmed at how fast it's been spreading, I believe the county should take on the job of spraying all the land.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor River?
Just clarification, all the land or just the county land?
No, well, I know in reading the reports, it says, makes a differentiation between public land and private land. I think we shouldn't make that separation. I think it should be all the lands that are affected across the county. I mean, in the beginning, Sarnia covered theirs, and that was sort of new to me, to us. We hadn't really realised the impact of it all at the time fully. But Lambton Shores alone has not done anything for Port Franks or that area. So I think rather than doing it piecemeal and not covering everything and stopping it going further, I really would like the county to spray all the lands that are affected.
Councillor Beans and then Councillor Miller.
Yeah, I would like to agree with that, but I would think that would cost, I don't think we have the money in the budget for that. Am I right?
Mr. Cole, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, through you, Chair. Well, I mean, no, we haven't included that in the budget for next year at this point. We still have the ability to do that on a very short notice basis. Up until this point, we've solely been acting as a public, albeit very large, public property owner, just like any other property owner in the area. And there are some other very large property owners, especially in the Port Franks area. The ABCA, Nature Conservancy of Canada, as well as Lambton Wildlife, all have properties comparable, not as large as ours, but you know, comparable in massiveness. I know that the city of Sarnia spent $90,000 last year for the stretch just in their municipality along the North Shore. If we were to expand that out to include all of Lambton County, depending on what those parameters would be, where we decided what was in and what was out, you could scale that up from that $90,000 price tag in those municipalities by land mass. I have not looked at what that land mass would be, so I'm sorry I couldn't give you a figure, but it, you know, you can imagine from that $90,000 price tag up.
Okay. Councillor Miller had his hand up earlier.
Yeah, my comment was the same really as Ian's. I'm concerned about what this would cost. And also bear in mind that Lambton Shores is not the only place that's been plagued with these. And this is a big county, so I'd have a lot of trouble, I believe, supporting that.
Councillor Bird, did you have another comment?
Thank you, through the chair, to everybody. Can I propose, and could I make a motion that we, as Mr. Cole said, we don't know what the extent would be financially. So if I would like to propose a motion that we ask staff to get a quote from Zimmer Air for covering all of this, and then make a point of adding this to the budget. And when we deliberate in February and pass everything in March, I would really like this to go forward. If I can get somebody to second that.
Councillor Bradley, you're mute.
I'll second it for discussion.
For discussion? Okay. Mr. Cole, did you have a comment on that?
I just, maybe it would be helpful to be clear. I'm a little unclear on what our parameters would be, because we would be looking at the whole of Lambton County in its entirety. I guess the ministry's defoliation mapping has just come out, actually even since the writing of that report. I could use that as a basis to provide that estimate to Zimmer Air, but we don't have a service like the city of Sarnia retained last year and just recently retained bioforest. We don't have anybody like that on board right now to make that assessment or judgment.
Councillor Hand.
I'm going to admit I'm new to this topic, just coming on AM now, but in the letters that were received from residents, Port Franks and whatnot, they're talking about that mapping and saying it's not up to date because of their initiatives in recruiting in their neighborhoods and whatnot.
Through you, Ms. Chair. So that's a different mapping. So the
Okay.
mapping that was referred to in those letters, the private company who has initiated that conversation with those volunteers and landowners, including ourselves, Zimmer Air, they are mapping, they are placing all the properties that have agreed to sign up to a contract on a map. And I think the point of those letters was that they don't want the county to think that there's no support for private land spraying in Port Franks just because their properties haven't been logged on that map yet. They've got all the information and they'll be on that map shortly. That was the point of the majority of those letters that I know many of you received.
So,
Councillor Napper? Sorry, he was the first one I saw.
no, it's okay.
Well, thank you very much. It seems to me like a pretty reasonable request. It's just a good neighbor act. These folks have done a lot of work to get this there, and it's done on a area by area basis. I know I have complaints out here about it, but it just seems everybody else around is spraying their property, and we're in the middle of it, and it's all for naught for what they've done, and I think it's a reasonable request myself.
Just for clarification, Councillor Napper, I believe Councillor Bird is proposing that we do more than just what was outlined in the report here. And also, you're talking about only spraying the lands that are being affected by the Gypsy moth, not all of the county, right?
Well,
That's right.
This is the request we got before us today, and that's what.
Councillor Weber?
Just, first of all, we have two motions on the floor, which shouldn't have, but so the Pinery Provincial Park is part of within Lambton County, and the Pinery is not spraying and does not want spray on their land. Nature Conservancy does not. I think the plan that has been proposed is a very good plan. It's individuals looking after individual properties, just like our report that we've got here looks after our property, the county-owned property, which is the museum and some other pieces of property. So I think by being the good neighbor that we are and spraying a buffer and not objecting to the property, and that's what the Municipality of Lambton Shores has done, we're going to not object. You need a waiver from properties. Not everybody wants their property sprayed. So I will not be supporting the motion to spray everything at taxpayers' cost. I will be supporting the original report that is with all the research that we've done. I know all of the maps may not be updated for Zimmer, but the communities around have and individuals and street by street have put in to pay and look after their own property. It's private property, and it would set quite a precedent if we decide that we're looking after pests. We didn't do it when we had emerald ash borer, or we didn't go in and remove trees on private property. This would really set a precedent if we just went ahead and sprayed everything for everybody. So I won't be supporting the second motion, but I will be supporting the recommendation from staff.
Okay, thank you for that point of order, Councillor Weber. I'm wondering, Councillor Bird, I'll get to you in just 1 second. Mr. Cole, there are a number of farmers who are organic in Lambton County as well. How does spray, just random spray, like is being considered, affect the organic properties?
To answer that question, Chair, I don't think I have a firm answer on that directly. What I will tell you is that the spray that's being used is it's a bacterium spray. It's an organic, or it's a like it's not a chemical agent, it's a natural agent. So it may be acceptable and it may not. My lack of knowledge of the organic farming practice is the failure here.
Okay.
So we would have to investigate that and look into that to see.
Councillor Bradley and then Councillor Bird. Sorry, Councillor Bird.
Can I get clarity of what's actually on the floor? Mayor Weaver.
The first motion that is on the floor was the good neighbor motion that was introduced in the report that we have. So perhaps we should deal with that motion first, since that was the first motion put on the floor. We have a mover and a seconder for that motion. However, I will allow some more discussion if it needs to be had before we go to the vote on that. Councillor Bird.
Thank you, through the chair. I would just like to say that, you know, after reading many letters from all the residents of Port Franks and, you know, everybody's opinions of what works, what doesn't work, if we allow, if we give the go-ahead for certain subdivisions privately to do their own thing and take care of this, the whole point through this was that going door to door to get everybody's input is going to take so long before they get that populated into the website of Zimmer Air, that by the time they've finished that, so that Zimmer Air can see the enormity of what they're expected to spray and give them a price for it, the time will have gone. The time is now, and they won't have that done ready for the springtime. So we need to do something. We need some action right now to help these people. So if anybody else has got a better idea, I'm willing to listen. Thank you.
Councillor Bradley and then Councillor Beans.
Objectives to Mr. Cole. You can't take immediate action on this right now anyhow, correct? If I recall from what the city went through, the timing is critical. I'm no expert on this, but the timing is critical when the action is taken, and it's further along in this year, is it not? We could authorize the action, but we can't do anything till, was it spring? I don't think the city actually acted on it till close to summer.
Mm-hmm.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, the actual spraying takes place in late spring, right? So I believe it's May, June. That's when the actual, what happens. Zimmer Air has they have a contract deadline now. I don't have it right in front of me. I think it's the end of April 1st, so the end of March, that they need to have all of the contracts of people who are spraying to sign up by that time in order to organize their flight pass and get their flight approvals. So I think these are the challenges that are being had by the various community. Some community groups have and neighborhoods have already signed up entirely. And I know that the Port Franks community is still working towards that. I don't have a direct idea of exactly what percentage or not what percentage they don't have already signed up. So whether or not they're able to meet that deadline is not entirely clear to me. Or I shouldn't speak on their behalf.
Councillor Bird and then Councillor, oh, did I miss somebody that had his hand up? Sorry, Councillor Bean had his hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Roundboats. I support the original motion, and I think if we're going to look at spraying the whole county, we need to know what the financial implication is, and I think we got to have some sort of an idea going forward. And I think we should support the original motion and bring it back to council once Mr. Cole has a chance to look at some numbers and go from there, because I don't think everybody in the county is going to want this spraying. So I think we need to do more research.
Councillor Bird?
Yeah, thank you, through the chair. And that's really important. I agree with Councillor Bean and Councillor Bradley that you don't spray until the late spring. But we do need the answer on costs, and we also, the time for action in getting everything ready for the process is now. And once we get the information back from Mr. Cole, we need to put some provision into the budget just in case, because it's no good wanting the money afterwards. So we have to be fully prepared and have everything lined up ready. Thank you.
Councillor Weaver.
Yes, I believe most of the communities are working towards this. If we say that, oh, maybe we're going to spray it by the county and you don't have to get those things, those waivers signed or those things in the community, it's just going to delay the process. Right now it's on track. Zimmer, I believe, understands the area that needs to be sprayed, and he's working towards that. I think by this second motion would cause more confusion, and I believe when it comes to budget time, if we're talking $1 million to spray the county, that areas in the county that don't need spraying or don't want spraying, I think it would just, to me, it would not pass. To add and I think it'll be $1 million or more if we're going to spray the county. And again, you have to still get people can say they don't want their property sprayed, and you still have to look after that. I don't know that Zimmer has the capability to spray the entire county. It doesn't seem practical. I will be supporting the first motion, which is a good neighbor motion, which is similar to what the Conservation Authority is doing, what Lambton Shores is doing, and I think it's the right way to proceed.
I believe we've allowed for ample conversation on this. I'll allow Councillor Hand, since she put her hand up, and then we're going to vote on the first motion that was put on the floor, which is the good neighbor motion. Councillor Hand.
So from reading the letters, it seemed like many of the neighborhoods were well along the path. They've done a lot of work, as we talked about. But if there's a tight timeline with Zimmer, perhaps if there's a chance to ask them for a little leverage there to allow all of that, the compilation be done by these individuals that are going door to door in their neighborhoods and whatnot. Maybe, I mean, if you don't have to spray till June, maybe there's a chance to shift it a little bit to make sure they can get all of their people signed up and get their paperwork in order.
Okay, thank you. Unless there's anything really pressing that needs to be said, I am going to call the vote for the first motion, which is the recommendation on the report that was given to us by the county. Councillor Bradley, did you have something to add? I don't want to cut anybody off.
No, I just say we can vote on this motion, and for subsequent action or another motion, then we can deal with that then. I'm really concerned on the bigger issue. This is not a good way to make public policy and decisions at this stage. So anyhow, I would just call the question and then see if any other motions come forward.
Okay, so the first motion that's on the floor is the one that is on the report, A, B, C, and D. Is everyone clear on the motion that we are voting on? Okay, all in favor of that recommendation? That is carried. So Lambton County is going to be a good neighbor and spray our lands. So we are going to move on to the report dated January 20th regarding, I believe that the second motion is kind of voided now that we have decided to be a good neighbor and do the spraying of our own lands. Is that true? How it works, Stefan, can you clarify that for me? Or how does this work? Do we have to take on the second motion?
So there is a second motion on the table, which is moved by Councillor Burt, seconded by Councillor Bradley, that there be at least a cost estimate sought out there for the future for spraying the entirety of the county. So in my mind, that's a motion that you can still vote on that would not necessarily be contrary to the current directions that are being suggested to County Council by this committee.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. We will vote on that motion. Does anybody want to speak to that further Councillor Bradley.
Yeah, first of all, I did not support the city spraying. It was $90,000, and I thought it was the responsibility of the property owner. And as someone pointed out, we didn't do that with the ash borer and other things. However, I do think it's prudent, and I have had dialogue with the group and that's been proposing the time of spring. I do think it's prudent, and given the $90,000 that it costs in the city for a fairly small piece of area, I think it's going to be very large in cost, which I think Mayor Weaver's indicated. But I think we have an obligation to find that out, and if it can be done in general terms, Mr. Cole, so that we know those numbers, and then look at whether we should proceed with that. There's no harm in getting the costing.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Then I will call the motion which is to get costing on what it would be to spray the entirety of all of the affected lands in the county. All in favor of that? Opposed? Okay, it looks like that motion has carried, so Mr. Cole will look forward to your report. Do we have a timeline on that? I'm assuming it would be either at the next committee AM meeting. Councillor Bird.
Thank you, through the chair. I would suggest as soon as possible, and at the next full meeting when we have our budget deliberations, I think that would be a good time for this, if that's possible.
Is that a realistic timeline for you, Mr. Cole?
I'm sorry, those are two different timelines. So our next full meeting is February, the first week of February. The budget deliberations are the first week of March. The first for the reports for the first week of February, our reports will be due in, I believe, the end of this week or early next week. I can try to make that timeline. If not, it can be prepared for, I'm sure I can have something for the next committee meeting, which is the third week of February.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, we'll look forward to seeing that report. Is everyone comfortable moving on to the next report? All right, so we will deal with the report regarding planning and development services staffing levels. We need a motion to have that put on the floor. Moved by Councillor Napper, seconded by Councillor Hand. Any questions or comments about that resolution?
I would move the recommendation.
I believe we have a mover and a seconder to that.
Okay.
Mr. Cole, did you want to comment on any of that? It was a very well-written report. I think everybody's pretty clear on what is needed.
Through you, Chair. Our manager of Planning and Development Services is present. If there's any questions on that, I think I agree. I think the report was everything that you needed to know was in that report, and I don't have anything to add.
Okay, if everyone's comfortable, I'll call the vote then. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Is there any other business for this section of committee? Mr. Bradley or Councillor Bradley?
Mr. Cole, the council had asked for a meeting with the St. Clair Conservation Authority. Is that set at this point in Zoom meeting to deal with some of the, and this is pre the legislative changes. Is that date set yet for that meeting?
Through you, Chair. Nope. We sent that council direction to the St. Clair Conservation Authority and the ABCA, the Subbel Bayfield Conservation Authority, after our last council meeting, which had clear direction that if we don't have a coordinated approach or a response back from them proposing a date and how that's going to be done and they're going to participate, that we would proceed to set something up by the end of January. So I'm I'm ready to set up a Zoom meeting and send out notices at any moment. But we haven't had a formal response back from them.
Okay, my suggestion, go ahead and do that, and if they don't choose to come, then they can deal with that in the court of public opinion.
Okay. Any other new business? I'm assuming we can take that as direction to staff. We don't need a motion in terms of that. Is that?
That's correct. It's recorded as an item in our minutes, and we'll move forward with that.
Okay, thank you. All right, seeing no other new business, we will go on to Public Health Services Division. We have 3 pieces of correspondence there to be received and filed. We need a motion to do that. Moved by Councillor Weber and seconded by Councillor Miller. Any questions or comments on those correspondence? Councillor Bradley?
I'm just asking, we endorse number C. We've endorsed it at the county level before, that of a basic income for those in poverty. I think it's important we tell these other communities that we're with them, and I think we've actually been ahead of the curve on doing that in the last year or 2.
So you're moving to endorse the letter in correspondence C?
Yes, to reduce poverty and improve household food security.
Do we have a second to that?
It's a policy of the county, so the last couple of years.
So Councillor Napper, you want to second that, or do you want to speak to that? Sorry, you are.
Seconded, I'm sorry, I couldn't get my.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to speak to that? All in favor of that motion? That is carried. Okay, and we do need to receive and file the rest of those correspondence. All in favor of receiving and filing that? That is carried. We have one report requiring a couple of reports, sorry, requiring a motion. So we'll deal with those individually. We'll start with the report regarding medical tiered response agreement. Councillor Bradley, are you motioning to support that resolution?
I'm moving that there's 3 parts to the resolution. And I'm
Okay.
moving that the status quo not be maintained, that the return to what we had since 2014 start January the 25th. And then the other 2 parts I'm fine with for working out the actual details. If I get a second, I'd like to speak to it.
Councillor Bird, you're seconding that?
Yeah, I can express to you how important this is to the community here. And that, and I've got all the documents, I'm not going to take you through all those, but when the agreement was suspended last year by the former chief, it was done for the right reasons with COVID and the concern and lack of knowledge of what this actually meant to emergency workers. And it is the local council, mayor, and the fire chief that determine the level of service. So when we were advised of that, we were told we'll resume in full with timelines as deemed appropriate by the fire chief. And the new fire chief has deemed it appropriate to go back. So we suspended it, now we're back, and we'd like to move forward and go back to where we were. I know this gets me in trouble with some of the responders, but in a city with 5 fire stations and 2 ambulance stations, there's no concern from the citizens. They just want someone to show up and to be there. And the multi-tiered response, the tiered response does that. And I think it's to the benefit of EMS, and I think and this is not to me a fight over who's better or who should be in the front door. It's who can get there and support each other, EMS and fire. So I would like to see us move back by January 25th to the tiered response and the information coming out of Wallaceburg. And then they can work on a new agreement, which probably is needed because the sands do shift on these types of services over time. And we've seen that going back to 2014. So it's not a criticism. I'll live with the fact that EMS is suggesting this is not the thing to do right now. We're suggesting as a city, and I can tell you, we had a unanimous vote of council on this issue the other day. We take this very, very seriously. We don't want any stalling. We want the service resumed so that people in this community can receive the best service possible from EMS, from fire and from police when they're called on an emergency.
Just to clarify, Councillor Bradley, you are asking to go back to the October 2014 criteria or the late 2017 criteria?
I'm asking that we bring Wallsford back in doing dispatch. The criteria would be what we used in the past, and then we would negotiate a new agreement by no later than May 1st. I think everyone can win from that direction. Without, Warden Weaver knows this, and so does past Warden Weaver knows this, and the present Warden. We don't need this conflict. We really simply don't at a time of crisis, health-wise. We just don't need it, and I don't want to see the rift between the city and the county, because it's a very emotional issue, and I would just like us to move forward and then get a new agreement, but at the same time get back to where we were before in the meantime.
Councillor Hand, you wanted to speak to this, and then Warden Marriott. Councillor, you are muted.
Sorry, I have really not understanding why they want to change it now when we're still in a lockdown and still in the pandemic. The reason that we changed the criteria, and I'm speaking on behalf of the way our firefighters operate, is by responding to less calls. Our citizens are still taken care of by all the support services, but we're not putting our firefighters in as much conflict with what they could run into with other individuals and perhaps, pick up an illness where we can't afford to have an illness run through our department being so small. So I just don't understand the timing of we've been going since March and all of a sudden, no, we can't do this anymore like that. I don't understand the timing.
Actually, Councillor Bradley, I'm going to let Warden Marriott, speak to this because he had his hand up first, and then I'll come back to you. Warden Marriott.
Thank you, Chair Rambo. So I just wondered if there was any legal implications of this, if Mr. Tifo could comment, with the agreement the way it is not.
Okay.
Thank you. Through the chair, I can offer a number of comments which I think at the end of the day, which would be consistent with what Councillor Mayor Bradley is suggesting, but with a caveat that due to concerns that I'm sure you should hear from EMS with respect to the current pandemic, COVID-19, and the arrangements that were made back in March, on account of that, and of course the situation worsening, that we get to the point where the parties obviously need to sit down, negotiate that 2014 agreement, but that they do so maintaining the current service level that was entered into on account of COVID-19 up until a couple months from that. And I think the report suggests May 1st or whatever the date may be, so that everybody has all the factors and all of the stakeholders' interests at stake, and ultimately we end up with a patient-focused, patient outcome resolution that again takes into account all of the stakeholders. I don't want to occupy too much airtime on this, but there are, let's call it, regulatory considerations. Secondly, of course, there's a 2014 agreement that needs to be addressed. And then thirdly, where do we go from there? I'll address the regulatory piece. Of course, City Fire and the City of Sarnia has full authorization over its fire prevention and protection fire department under that legislation. And of course, the County of Lambton has full authorization, legal authorization and jurisdiction over paramedic services, so our emergency medical services folks. The agreement, the arrangement that you have in front of you that needs to be considered is essentially a voluntary medical mutual aid agreement that is entered into between emergency response providers, for instance, police, fire, and paramedics. In this case, the agreement was entered into 2014 for the provision of assistance to the paramedics, medical assistance to the paramedics. by the fire services. And the recipient of that, i.e. the subject matter expert being EMS, the paramedics, are the recipient of that service. And therefore these mutual aid agreements are typically viewed and governed through the lens of the subject matter expert, the paramedics in this case. But nonetheless, everybody understands fully within our community, between the county and the city, that we do have highly trained individuals and paramedics and police and firefighters. We have individuals that are highly engaged, highly enthusiastic, but we're still dealing with COVID-19, which gets me to this notion that the issue is, from a lawful jurisdictional perspective, is one that requires bilateral mutual voluntary agreement. In the absence of a bilateral mutual voluntary agreement, there is no agreement. And as a result of that, the Ministry of Health has its own guidelines as to what happens in those circumstances. But nobody's interested in that. Everybody's interested in working under an agreement. With respect to the agreement that's before you, 2014, it does specify the services that EMS will call upon the fire department from the city of Sarnia to provide, to aid in. There was an attempt in 2017 to revisit that based on new evolving considerations. And when you talk about medical information or medical services, you always have to look at and update. I think Mayor Bradley was mentioning this. You always have to update that. You always have to talk. It is what it is. The doctors at the hospital are not going to sit there and say, 2014, that's the only standard we're going to listen to, and that's the only standard we're going to go by. Things change, and therefore you need to sit down. There was an attempt made in 2017. Unfortunately, it didn't work. What happened is that it was left as is, and now we have the COVID piece. The COVID piece did result in a reduction, in a throttling, if I can call it that way, a throttling of that agreement, so that, as I understand it, the fire department from the city of Sarnia responds on about 40%, or perhaps a little bit more, of the prior pre-COVID calls. My understanding is that the arrangement that was entered into in March of 2019 was meant for to deal with the community transmission COVID issues and to last throughout the pandemic. And of course it did, because as you'll see, as it is just the facts we'll cite, is that there was a lockdown, so to speak, in March. There was a pullback in May when we opened up society a little bit. Summer went by, and of course things got worse in the fall from a COVID perspective, when we are now in the lockdown, stay-at-home environment where, from a COVID perspective, we're facing with a greater variants of this disease, the UK variant or whatever it is that they're calling it, where there's transmission issues. So the arrangement was to say that during that, there'll be a throttling where there's about 40% of the response from the city of Sarnia, and the COVID piece still exists. But in December, as I understand it, there was an ask from the city fire to get back to the full gamut pre-COVID. And as I understand it, and I'm providing this from a dispute resolution perspective, what makes sense to move forward. My understanding is that there's still concerns from COVID, and there still needs to be a discussion that has a meaningful discussion that hasn't taken place since, as I understand, 2014. So the ask, with all that in mind, the ask from the county at this point in time is not significantly different from Mayor Bradley's ask or Councillor Bird's ask, is to say, hey, look at this context, look at the regulatory context, look at the arrangement, the agreement context, and the agreement itself actually contemplates the parties' continuous discussions through a committee, but that unfortunately just hasn't happened. Take a look at the COVID perspective as well, and then have the parties sit down, hammer out an agreement. And the reason I say that is it's a hot potato that really ought not be on your laps. We have to admit that. It's a hot potato that administration needs to deal with. Given all of those circumstances, taking into account what I've just explained, the regulatory environment, the contractual arrangements, i.e. the continuous disclosure, the continuous dialogue that needs to happen given the nature of the services, the long-standing relationship that the county has between the paramedics and the fire, and the fact that these are highly trained, highly engaged individuals, COVID-19 is to sit there and say, okay, hammer out an agreement, send us back, say, hammer out an agreement. COVID-19 is still an issue. Hammer out an agreement within the next period of time that is consistent and that takes into account all of the stakeholders' interests. In the absence of that, from a dispute resolution perspective, and I'm just giving you this for your own consideration because you need to know everything in terms of your options. In the absence of that, it's the term, the 2014 agreement didn't have a specific term. It didn't say this is a 10-year agreement or 15-year agreement. There is no term. It can be terminated from day to day between the parties. There's no interest at all whatsoever. The other option is the recommendation that you see in front of you, which is a slight modification from Mayor Bradley's. And in our view, given a long-standing relationship between the parties, the necessity that they work together on the streets to be patient-focused, it makes sense to return the hot potato to those two parties and say, you need to hammer a deal by sitting down together in good faith, exchanging all relevant, pertinent information, all your data, and come back with a proposal that is mutually acceptable to both groups. In the meantime, mostly because of COVID-19 and the understanding that was reached between the two parties on account of COVID-19, you still throttle your responses to this 40% or so amount of cases. And then the recommendation is consistent with that, the regulatory framework, the contractual framework, and the fact that asking for a couple months for the parties themselves to regularize, meaning to really get back to the table and stabilize what is going on, would be, in my mind, a very good investment in the decades-long relationship that will continue. Taking into account all relevant factors, and especially we know the stakeholder interests. We do know them, taking into account all of those interests. So for me, the other option is, of course, you just say, go with a 2014 agreement. And the 2014 agreement already contemplates, since 2014, discussions and renewals. They haven't happened. So that's the problem. Like, what we need to force a sit down. The 2014 agreement ultimately will move forward. It's throttled because of COVID-19, but needs to be revisited. It just hasn't been revisited at the end of the day. If you were to say, just do 2014 and negotiate, well, that's what the 2014 agreement already says. It already says that. To me, if we're going to move forward with that, there can be further issues that develops. I agree with Mayor Bradley. If there's going to be any kind of dispatching of this, it has to come through CAC. It absolutely has to come through CAC. Otherwise, we have privacy issues, privacy impact, privacy compliant issues, and other regulatory issues that involves with a separate type of dispatch, which we don't necessarily need to get into. So all of that, I don't want to occupy much more airtime. From a regulatory perspective, from a historical contractual perspective, from a COVID-19 perspective, from an arrangement that was entered into between the parties to account for COVID-19, from the perspective that we are currently in COVID-19 and there are some serious issues ongoing, unfortunately, it's to say, hey, look, regularize your relationship, use the next couple of months, hammer something out, remain throttled for the health and safety of everybody. And I know that there's PPE. Everybody talks about, well, I've got PPE, you've got PPE. But again, it's patient-centered. You're entering into people's homes. The patients themselves are not PPE'd. So with that in mind, say, hey, look, this is not a hot potato, and unfortunately it's here, but it's not a hot potato that council should take. It's really going to put the pressure back on us to get a mutually acceptable agreement that takes into account all of the stakeholders' interests. And we know all of those interests. And I'm pretty confident that the effort that can be put into it between both sides, we've worked with the City of Sarnia administration, we've got all confidence with that. If we can use another 2 to 3 months or whatever it is, whatever the period you allow us, the guarantee is that the effort will be put in to hammer out a deal. I can only guarantee the effort. I can only guarantee that there'll be a good faith effort. I can't guarantee an outcome, but I suspect that the outcome will be better than where we are now. Subject to any questions, those are my comments.
Thank you. Councillor Bradley. You are muted.
Mayor Hand, the Association of Firefighters, the leadership of the firefighters here, I'm more than willing to go back into dealing with what they were dealing with before because of the personal protection equipment they believe that can be in place. However, to Mr. Tebow, I appreciate that was an excellent overview there. Where I'm going now, I'm willing to table this motion, but because these talks have been going on, because the two administrations could not come together, I guess, for a final report, I like deadlines, and I like tight deadlines, and I'm just going to run this by you before I bring it, because I don't want to do something that's impossible. What I would like to suggest that we table this, but it be concluded and brought back to the March 3rd County Council meeting. And I realize that's further ahead than you want, but at the same time, I think that forces the city and the county with identifiable issues to either resolve them or come back on March the 3rd, because I don't want this gap in service in the community to last to May the 1st. So I guess I'm putting the question before I put the motion. Is March the 3rd doable? I'm willing to extend it a little bit, but not beyond that, because April, May is way too far.
Mr. Tivo, do you want to answer that?
Yes, first of all, by definitely appreciating the opportunity and the time to deal with this. I think as I looked at this on a personal level and evaluating this, it harkens back to my older brother and myself going to my parents and saying, we've got a problem with it. And they're saying, you get the backhand and say, go solve your problems. But I think from the March 3rd perspective, I have to leave that to EMS management and that group to respond to that, to see if they can manage those timelines. So Mr. Taylor's on the phone or on the Zoom, and perhaps he can respond better to that.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mr. Taylor, did you want to respond, or Mr. Pensino?
Yeah, thank you, and through you, Chair. With respect to the timeline being March 3rd, I know staff's minds are obviously busy getting ready for budget, etc. However, I'm going to just spin this to Mr. Pansino to see if that's a workable date.
Thank you, Andrew, and through you, Chair. Certainly, as the report recommended, item C indicated, no later than May 1st, and that was, knowing that it is a complex issue. There are many factors at play, but certainly I have no issues. And our most recent meeting of January 7th, we left the meeting with that offer, both for the fire chief and myself to meet offline and continue that dialogue. And also we'd left that meeting with the offer that our respective education leadership continue the dialogue as well to work through the evidence-based patient-centered piece on this. So I think that's the fundamental driver. I agree with the mayor. I agree with everyone that's been speaking. This is a highly emotional issue. It has the potential to greatly affect the front lines. But that's why, it is really imperative that, we get the education leadership together. We bring in the medical experts, because that removes the emotion from it. Because this is, at the end of the day, a health service, and medicine is based on evidence. Frankly, my opinion doesn't matter on this. It's what the medical experts and what the evidence says in providing that care. So I'm more than happy to reach out again, to re-engage with fire leadership, as early as this afternoon, to say, let's set up some dates and let's continue the dialogue that we left the January 7th meeting offering to do. So I think the caveat I'll throw in there is, we are somewhat beholden on a couple of factors. One, the ongoing COVID situation, our resources right now, those are fluctuating really day to day on what we're being tasked to do. And secondly, the availability of the medical experts. So we have engaged, they have already indicated their willingness to assist both sides in coming to this. So it would be subject to their availability as well. But I don't see anything that precludes us from moving forward.
We do have time constraints this morning. We do have another meeting set in 6 minutes, so we have to get through the rest of this agenda. Councillor Bradley, did you want to table that motion then?
I'm going to bring this to a conclusion so we can move the agenda.
Sorry, it's very difficult to hear you.
Okay.
I'll just ask you to speak.
I'm doing my best here, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Ongoing issues here with this computer. I'm trying to be fair on this. I also know deadlines are really important. So what I'm going to suggest to table my motion, with the expectation of getting a report back by March the 3rd County Council meeting, and no later than the April 7th meeting at the very end drop dead date, mainly because of the issues of trying to engage other people, mainly because of the problems and other duties with COVID on both the county and the city side. So what I'm saying, tabling this to March the 3rd, and if you can't meet that deadline, the drop dead date would be the April 7th County Council meeting. So I'm trying to be fair, and I think it's fair for both sides, but it puts pressure on both sides to resolve this really important issue. That's
Okay, Councillor Bird, you were the seconder to that. Are you comfortable with tabling the motion?
I am.
Okay, I'm going to call that vote then. All in favor of tabling the motion with the parameters that Councillor Bradley just outlined.
Clarification on what are we tabling?
You're tabling the motion that I moved, Mayor Weber, that the service be reinstated, the tiered response by January 25th, and then the other two aspects of the motion that's in the report. So I guess the May 1st part is out. It would simply table it. The two staffs work together, expecting it to get back by March 3rd County Council. And if they can't, for whatever reason, because there's lots of good reasons why they couldn't, then the drop dead date is April the 7th. That's the two.
I'm fine with the dates, but my clarification is on, are we at the status quo or are we going back to 2014?
No.
His original motion, I believe, was to not go with the status quo, but to resume services as they were. That was your original motion, was it not, Councillor Bradley?
That's the one being tabled.
That's being tabled.
If I could speak to address Mayor Weber's concern, by tabling it, you basically kept the status quo till whatever date.
Okay.
Right. Okay, all in favor of tabling that motion? That is carried. Thank you. We are going to go on to the next motion, which is the Senior Advisory Committee Recommendation Report. Do we have a mover and a seconder? Councillor Beans, are you moving that?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Miller. Any questions or comments on that report? It was really well written. Easy to understand. Councillor Weber, did you want to speak to that?
I know we're short on time. What is this committee actually going to do for Lambton County and for the seniors? We have seniors groups in each municipality. We have a health unit that works with the seniors across the county. Is this just another level of time and effort by staff to coordinate a committee and put things together? I guess if I don't see the purpose other than it's a new committee.
Staff, did you want to address that question?
Sure. Through you, Councillor Roundboats. Thank you for the question. You'll recall that the presentation was done by the Navigating Care Seniors Lambton Group for County Council. Staff took away, worked with the group very closely, and without any views to just be open-minded and see what's out there in the landscape. And then what we learned from our research is there's some really successful models out there that help to advocate for seniors' interests. So staff are comfortable working with this group that the recommendations will benefit the County of Lambton. There's going to be the formulation of an advisory group that can advocate on behalf of seniors' interests. This aligns with the County of Lambton strategic plan as well as Lambton Public Health, and we think it's a good place to be. And in the interest of time, I'll just leave it there unless there's any further questions.
Any further questions?
Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, all in favor of moving the or approving the recommendation? That is carried. We are going to move on to the Student Nutrition Program Food Funding Report. We need a mover and a seconder to have that report put on the floor. Moved by Councillor Weber, seconded by Councillor Napper. Questions or comments on that report? Seeing none, in the interest of time, all in favor? That is carried. We're going to move on to, is there any other business?
Oh, we'll just, all the COVID business is moved to Dr. Ronaday's meeting behind this one. Thank you,
Thank
Council.
you. We'll move on to Cultural Services Division. There are 2 information reports that we need to receive and file. We need a mover and a seconder for those. Moved by Warden Marriott, seconded by Councillor Beans. Any questions or comments on either of those? All in favor of receiving and filing those? Thank you. That is carried. We have a couple of reports requiring a motion. The first is regarding library's donation report May 1st, 2020. We need a mover and a seconder for that. Thank you, Councillor Hand. Councillor Miller, questions or comments on that report? It's great to see those donations happening. All in favor? That is carried. We have the second report regarding the status of libraries located in the city of Sarnia. We need a mover and a seconder for that. Moved by Councillor Weber, seconded by Warden Marriott. Questions, comments on that report? Seeing none, all in favor? That is carried. Is there any other business for cultural services? Mr. Meyer, you've done a great job. We're letting you off easy today. All right, we'll go on to the CAO office. There is a letter from Warden Marriott dated January 13th regarding the SWIFT board member representation. I'm assuming Councillor Weber and Councillor Napper, you're moving and seconding that. Any questions or comments on that? All in favor of that recommendation? That is carried. We have no in camera. So we are going to call for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Hand, seconded by Councillor Beans. Sorry to have rushed the latter part of that meeting, but I think it's good we're somewhat on time. Just to clarify, are we supposed to log out and log back in, I'm assuming?
Right.
Okay, thank you. We will see you all in a few minutes.